I will admit to you today that this passage is not an easy one to preach from. This passage, it's about a messy topic, and it cannot be tied up easily in a bow. And you will not walk out of here with all of your problems solved and your questions answered. So aren't you excited? And I will admit that writing this sermon triggered my depression a little bit, because this passage does not contain any redemptive qualities for humanity. And our text today, it kind of immediately makes you feel a bit icky. We have these Pharisees in this passage, and the Pharisees often get a bad rap, which I think is unfair, because they knew the law backwards and forwards, and Jesus tends to throw people off a little bit. But in the passage today, the Pharisees were pretty overtly judgy towards Jesus as a rabbi. And so they see Jesus' disciples sitting down to eat a meal, and you know that they were watching very closely. These close friends, these disciples of this rabbi that they did not like very much, they watched their every move to see if they would trip up and make a mistake. And the disciples give them what they wanted. They didn't wash their hands before a meal. Hand washing and giving a blessing before a meal is a Jewish commandment, and it's biblical. It's in Exodus 30, a commandment from God to Moses. And it says, whenever they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water so that they will not die. Also, when they approach the altar to minister by presenting a food offering to the Lord, they shall wash their hands and feet so that they will not die. This is to be a lasting ordinance for Aaron and his descendants for generations to come. And so the Pharisees, they knew this law backwards and forwards, but you didn't have to be a scholar of the law at that time to know that not washing your hands is a big violation. But by pointing this out to Jesus, instead of asking the disciples directly, they are insulting his knowledge of the law and his ability to create disciples. And Jesus shows us his human side with his reaction. I love moments like this, when Jesus gives those who insult him a good tongue lashing. I would just be on the sidelines eating popcorn, just watching the Son of God give a clap back. I love it. And so Jesus shakes his head in disbelief that people can be so rude, and he returns their knowledge of the law with a prophetic text from Isaiah. Quote, "The people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrine. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition," unquote. Wow. Woo. What on earth could Jesus mean by that? Because remember that hand washing is a commandment from God to Moses. How could Jesus call that a human tradition? It turns out that Jesus was calling out these Pharisees for disregarding the hundreds of other laws that existed at that time, particularly those 10 key commandments. And he gives the example of not honoring their father and mother. And essentially, Jesus tells them to quit their preoccupation with the sins of others and look at themselves. To quit the human tradition of being obsessed with other people's sins and mistakes. Stay in your lane, you hypocrites. And so classic hypocrisy, it occurs when an individual proclaims their moral values to others. and often critiques others for not following those same values, but then they turn around and do not apply that to their own life. And a preacher preaching on hypocrisy is very loaded territory. You know, the phrase, practice what you preach, literally came about because of corrupt priests and pastors who would preach morals in the pulpit and then turn around and throw those morals out the door. The truth is that we are all hypocrites at one time or another. Why? Because we are human. We make mistakes all the time. We are guided by our hearts, a problematic guide, as Jesus points out later in our passage. And Jesus delivers the shocking news that there is nothing about our appearance, our cleanliness, our bodily functions, our illnesses, our health. Nothing of the kind makes us unclean or unfit or unqualified to be a follower of God. And now you might be saying, okay, big whoop, Pastor Alice, I know that. But back then, this was a huge statement to make. And you can look in the book of Leviticus for the hundreds of ways that you could be made unclean and unfit to enter the temple. If you eat pig, rabbit, camel, insects, ew, certain types of birds like eagles and ravens, those creatures that swarm upon the earth. If you are pregnant, you are unclean. Morgan. If you just had a baby, you are unclean. If you had any sort of skin condition with flakes, rash, redness, bumps, lumps, ooze, if your body is leaking strange fluids, you are unclean. I don't think Jesus was rejecting all of these laws and the Jewish practices that surround them. And I do not think he was ridiculing the sacred laws that the Pharisees and other Jews follow. In fact, he takes the issue of defilement very seriously. And he names the source of all evil and poison in humanity, the heart. And indeed, being defiled and corrupted is something we need to watch out for. And its source, it's not what you would expect. It's the very place where love grows, where compassion's seeds are sown. In that same heart soil, evil can grow. And it can grow at a reckless rate. And I find this teaching of Jesus to be surprising, yet it makes perfect sense. You would figure the source of all evil would be the brain, but no, it's the heart. The unsuspecting, humble force behind the scenes, pulling all the strings. And Jesus could see the Pharisees' heart, a heart that was really scared of this new leader and what change he was bringing to their religion. And he knew that they feared that their whole world would change with this rabbi, and so they needed to belittle him and reduce the threat. So Jesus was not rejecting these sacred laws, but he was rejecting their presumption that their interpretation of the law was the only interpretation. And Jesus points out how the Pharisees are confusing their interpretation of the law with the law itself. He was rejecting the method of using the law to belittle and shame others, especially when you proclaim righteousness but do not practice it. And if you look in the book of Matthew, chapter 23, we have this famous woe to you passage where Jesus holds up the Pharisees as an example of not practicing what you preach. And he says to the crowds in this passage, the scribes and the Pharisees, they sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. But most of all, Jesus was rejecting their lack of vulnerability in their own faith struggles as Pharisees. Hypocrisy, it often occurs when we're just not able to admit that we are not perfect people. And when hypocrisy meets religion, it's a very tricky mixture. Because our faith is guided by commandments, guided by moral behavior. And we are called to spread the good news, and that often involves preaching about the commandments that God gives us. And a side effect of our faith is kind of wondering why others don't believe and practice the same thing that we do. And when we find ourselves falling short of the moral behavior that we preach and hold dear, it's much easier to point to someone else and their mistakes rather than our own. And in the current world that we live in, it's fascinating to watch this dynamic at work. And we live in a day and an age when religious tradition is absolutely colliding with a wave of social change. And it's a time in history where the moral laws of religion are coming into conflict with the world. And things are changing quite rapidly. And as a result, we can cling even tighter to what we believe, kind of like a life preserver. We have no idea what's going on, but we insist that we only have the right answers. And I see two sides emerge in this world, at least in my religious world of Christianity. One side holds fast to those rules and traditions of our faith and the Bible. And they might be strict laws, but they are the laws of their God to live morally. And they cherish them, and they live by them, and they expect everyone else to live up to them as well. Being a Christian means not being of the world. And these laws help set Christians apart as moral people. And this group tends to ask, why should the world make me bend my morals for them? Am I not supposed to live by any standards or principles at all? And then I see another side come up. Christians who know that these laws are written down in our book of faith, but they don't feel so sure about them because they can exclude others. And this group of Christians, it gives the laws like kind of a side eye, wondering how to handle them. Which laws do they follow? Which laws do they ignore? And they ask, how do I respect my book of faith while also respecting my gut intuition of what's right and just? And I can tell you, and you've probably figured this out by now, that I fall into the second side. I love my Bible, and its meaning for me I cannot describe in words. But I do have trouble reconciling some laws and commandments in its pages as inerrant truth. Some of the laws, they are easier to dismiss than others. Not eating certain foods is one we can often know about, but we'd not observe it. Wearing mixed fabrics doesn't bother us that much. Leviticus 11 says not to touch the skin of a pig, yet we watch and play football. But there are others that bother me that are just harder to ignore. Laws and commandments such as homosexuality is unnatural and violates God's will for humanity. Commandments that dictate certain gender roles, like women should be submissive and silent and not be leaders. And I know some people would call me hypocritical for calling myself a Christian and not following these laws, and they have. But I just can't accept that God would want me to reject anyone because of who they are. I'm sorry, I just can't. And I can't accept that God would want women to be silent in the church, obviously. I can't accept that someone should be punished for loving someone of the same sex, and that there's only one version of a relationship that is correct. And I just can't accept that God would put any system in place that punishes someone for being their true self or practicing their true God-given calling. Most of all, I can't accept rejecting anyone who was oppressed or ostracized because that's not what Jesus taught. But both of these sides of Christianity struggle with interpreting these biblical laws. And it is one of the greatest burdens that Christians bear because we are not given an answer on how these laws should be interpreted. There is no appendix in the Gospels. All biblical commentaries, including your pastor's sermons, are just interpretations. And we don't have the Son of God walking around in our society giving clarification on the absolute right answer and giving clapbacks to judgmental folks. And truth be told, it makes me a little irritated at God for not giving humanity more clarity. Because maybe if it was more transparent, we wouldn't be at each other's throats, condemning each other's beliefs and calling each other hypocrites. Wouldn't that be nice? But there is almost one certainty that we will live with as people of faith. It is almost guaranteed, no, it is guaranteed, that each person can read the laws given to Christians in the Bible, and every single person will have a different interpretation. So what do we do here when we encounter a situation like the Pharisees did, where we see something happening that violates what we believe to be right? Do we ignore it? Or do we speak out, putting ourselves in danger of becoming a hypocrite? How do we know which laws to follow and which ones to acknowledge with a nod and kind of move along? I don't have a definite answer for you. I am so sorry. I struggle with this just as much as you. But for me, I look at intention. I don't believe God made a bunch of laws to trick people up. And these laws, they are created to give a sense of order amidst all the chaos of life and help us be better people. I believe the 10 Commandments are a great model of laws that help us be better people. But take the hand washing, for example. God is holy and sacred. You should wash your hands before presenting an offering as a symbol of a clear before and after of the experience. Plus, it's generally a good idea to wash your hands. You literally might die if you don't. But the Pharisees, they knew that the disciples were not about to die. They were not concerned with their well-being and providing them with a saving word that they should wash their hands. They used the law to put themselves in a higher position. It all comes back to what Jesus said about the heart. Where does our desire for obeying the commandments come from? Am I using Scripture, the law, to justify my own righteousness? Am I trying to make myself to be holier than others? Is God convicting me to call this person out to better their life or to make them feel guilty and unworthy? I believe we are called to live our lives to the best of our ability. And sometimes we make mistakes, and we need to know that we made mistakes. But I don't think God divinely inspired the Scriptures so we could use them as weapons against each other. We should use this book that we love so much, the teachings of our ancestors, the stories of justice and healing, the wisdom of thousands of years of humans trying to figure this life thing out. We should use all of it to build each other up in the spirit of truth. Use it as a guide to live more like Jesus. The late and wonderful writer, Rachel Held Evans, she wrote that, quote, "Sometimes we are closer to the truth in our vulnerabilities than in our safe certainties." I think we are much closer to God when we live out our faith with vulnerability rather than clinging to our certainty. If we can live with the openness that we probably don't know everything about how God works, that we make mistakes a lot, but we just try to be a good person every day who sees the worth in every human being, I think that is much closer to the gospel. And I think church works so much better when we operate out of vulnerability rather than our certainty, even if that's not how our world operates. And it sounds simplistic, but we really just have to do our best day to day, living by the love and the gospel that Jesus demonstrated for us, and striving to create a world that Jesus tried to create. May it be so. Amen.